What if everything you've been taught about survival is outdated? We're used to thinking of winter in the wild as a time of hunger and despair, of empty forests and snow-covered, lifeless deserts. But for the indigenous peoples of North America, from the Great Plains to the forests of the Northeast, winter was not the end, but a challenge for which they prepared with remarkable foresight. Their pantries were hidden not behind walls, but under the snow, in the branches, and in the ground itself. They possessed knowledge that allowed them to see abundance where we see only emptiness. These products are not just food, but a whole philosophy of relating to nature, where nothing is superfluous and everything serves a common purpose: survival. We will immerse ourselves in the world of forgotten recipes and lost technologies that saved lives long before the advent of modern supermarkets. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn which one product, available to everyone but ignored by most, was the most important source of vitamins in the depths of winter, and how it saved people from diseases that were more terrifying than any predator. I will reveal one of the most closely guarded secrets of survival on the Great Plains, knowledge that has sustained entire tribes for centuries. This product was not just food, it was currency, a symbol of wealth, a warrior's rations, and sacred food with ritual significance. I am talking about pemmican, or as the Lakota called it, Vasna. This invention was a true marvel of nature and human ingenuity, allowing people to travel vast distances and survive frost, hunger, and storms. A small bag of pemmican could contain enough energy for several weeks of travel. The main ingredient was meat, most often bison, an animal on which life on the plains depended. After the autumn hunt, the meat was cut into long, thin strips and hung on wooden racks in the sun or over a slow, smoky fire. Sometimes the meat was dried in the wind, using cold air to avoid a smoky flavor. Within a few days, the moisture evaporated and the meat became brittle, like a thin sheet of glass. This process, slow but precise, removed water, depriving bacteria of their living environment. The result was a light, fragile product that could be stored indefinitely. However, this was only the first step. The dried meat was then placed on a stretched bison hide and carefully ground with heavy stones until it turned into a uniform powder. This powder, a kind of meat flour, was the basis of pemmican. At the same time, the women prepared the fat, the second most important ingredient. The internal fat of the bison, especially that surrounding the kidneys and internal organs, was rendered over a low heat. This process required attention and experience. Too strong a fire would spoil the fat, giving it a bitter taste. The resulting pure, transparent rendered fat was a natural preservative that coated the meat and protected it from the air. The third component was berries, most often dried and crushed cherries, saskatoons, honeysuckle, or cranberries. They added not only flavor and vitamins, but also acidity, which enhanced the shelf life of the product. These berries gave pemmican a slight sweetness and the aroma of the steppe, and together with meat and fat created the perfect nutritional balance. All this was carefully mixed by hand, with a sense of proportion and tradition passed down from generation to generation. The proportions were of great importance. For winter supplies or long trips, more fat was added, which when solidified, formed a dense protective layer. For ritual purposes, on the contrary, more berries were added to make the taste more pleasant. Sometimes a pinch of crushed medicinal herbs or salt was added to the mixture. The result was a product that could be stored without fire, salt, or cold, simply in a bag, and would not spoil for years. It was a true food technology ahead of its time. The finished pemmican was stuffed into bags made of rawhide, parfleche. These leather bags, tightly tied and coated with fat, were completely airtight. When the fat solidified, the contents turned into a hard, almost stone-like block that could be stored in the ground, in the sun, or even under the snow. In this form, pemmican could be stored for decades, remaining edible and completely safe. For hunters, caravanners, and warriors, it was a strategic reserve, the equivalent of modern army rations and energy bars in one. In winter, pemmican was indispensable. It could be eaten as is, cutting off pieces with a knife, and chewing slowly until the fat melted in the mouth. A small piece could sustain a person for a whole day in the cold. It was concentrated energy that allowed people to travel kilometers across the plains, carrying only their weapons and a bag of Vasna. Unlike fresh meat, it did not require fire and did not spoil in the cold. However, it was more often used hot. Several pieces of pemmican were thrown into a pot of water, and soon a thick, rich soup was produced, satisfying, fatty, and enveloping. Sometimes dried roots or wild herbs were added if available. Such a broth could warm an exhausted hunter or traveler better than any campfire. For the Lakota, Cree, Blackfoot, and other peoples of the plains, pemmican was not just food, but part of their spiritual heritage. It was used in ceremonies, offered to the spirits of ancestors, and given to guests as a sign of respect. In the Lakota language, the word Vasna meant not only a mixture of meat and fat, but also the very idea of abundance, generosity, and strength. It symbolized gratitude to the bison, the animal that gave life to the entire people. Each piece of Vasna contained a history of hunting, labor, nature, and prayer. Today, knowing about calories, proteins, and fats, we can scientifically explain why pemmican was so effective. Protein provided strength, fat provided energy and warmth, and berries provided vitamins and antioxidants. But for the peoples of the Great Plains, this was knowledge that did not require formulas. They simply knew that this product saved lives. It was pemmican that allowed them to survive in places where snow lies until spring, and hunting is not always successful. It was the pinnacle of practical knowledge and a symbol of respect for nature. So when we talk about ancient food, it's worth remembering that pemmican was not just a hunter's diet, but the foundation of culture, economy, and faith. It was fire enclosed in a bag, a reserve of life in case everything else failed. Thank you for watching. Where are you watching us from? What surprised you most about this ancient recipe created long before the science of nutrition existed? Write in the comments what you think about the wisdom of indigenous peoples, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to learn more about the ingenious survival methods of the ancient world. Are you ready to learn the truth about what lay at the heart of survival on the Great Plains, hidden deep beneath the earth? When snow covered the prairies and hunting became difficult, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Comanche tribes turned to the reserves they had made in the summer. One of the most important of these reserves was timpíla, or prairie turnip. This humble root vegetable, known to botanists as Pediomelum esculentum, was a real treasure. The plant blooms in the spring, and it was by its distinctive flowers that the women of the tribe found the location of the root. The root grew deep in the dense, often rocky soil of the prairies, and harvesting it was hard work. Special digging sticks called ishpu, often made of hard wood with a burnt and sharpened end, were used to harvest timpila. The women methodically dug up the ground, extracting dark roots that resembled carrots or small turnips. It was a collective effort that required knowledge of botany and tremendous patience. Fresh timpila has a slightly bitter taste, but it is very nutritious. However, its main value lay in its ability to be stored for long periods. After harvesting, the laborious process of preparing the roots for winter began. They were cleaned of soil, and the dark, tough skin was removed. The cleaned white roots were then cut into thin slices. These slices were laid out in the sun or on special drying racks. In the dry and hot climate of the plains, they quickly lost moisture, becoming hard and light. This was an ancient method of dehydration. Another method was to string the slices onto long cords made of tendons or plant fibers. These garlands of timpila were hung in teepees or in the sun, where they dried, protected from moisture and insects. Once dried, the root could be stored almost indefinitely. In winter, these dried slices were invaluable. The easiest way to use them was to add them to soup or broth. Together with pieces of dried bison meat and a spoonful of pemmican, timpila turned plain water into a thick and hearty winter lunch that restored strength. Dried timpsil could also be ground into flour using stone mortars and pestles. The resulting flour was rich in starch and protein and served as an excellent thickener for soups and sauces, such as the traditional berry sauce, vojapi. This flour was also used for baking. Mixing it with water and a small amount of fat, women baked small flatbreads on the coals of a fire. This bread was dense, filling, and had a unique, slightly nutty flavor. it was an excellent addition to a meat-based diet. The importance of timpíla cannot be overstated. In years when the bison hunt was unsuccessful, or blizzards lasted for weeks, it was these humble roots, stored in the summer, that stood between the tribe and starvation. They were a reliable, predictable, and nutritious source of food hidden underground. These roots were the basis of the plains diet. But what if I told you that the peoples of the eastern woodlands created an even more complex and sustainable system based on 3 plants they called sisters? In the next chapter, we will learn how the Iroquois turned agriculture into an art of survival. What you have never seen is how an entire people could survive the harsh winter of the Northeast almost exclusively on what they grew in the summer. For the Iroquois, or Haudenosaunee, who lived in their famous longhouses in the region of modern-day New York and southern Canada, the answer lay in the 3 sisters: corn, beans, and squash. But growing them was only half the battle. The real art was in preserving them. At the center of this system was corn, or maize. The Iroquois grew many varieties adapted to the local climate. In the fall after the harvest, the main process began: drying. The women gathered the ears of corn but did not clean them completely, instead bending back the husks and tying them together. These bundles, or braids of corn, were then hung from the ceiling of a longhouse. The smoke from the hearths, which burned constantly in the room, and the dry heat rising upward, slowly smoked and dried the kernels. This method not only removed moisture, but also protected the corn from insects and mold. The dry grain was stored directly in the cobs and, as needed, it was removed and shelled. The main winter dish was corn porridge, or sapin. The grains were crushed in large wooden mortars and then boiled for hours until a thick, nutritious mass was obtained. Often a little maple sugar or bear fat was added to it. The second sister was beans. They were also dried in pods and then shelled. Dried beans were an ideal source of protein during the winter months when hunting was limited. They were stored in large bark boxes or clay pots. Beans were added to corn porridge, creating a dish that we would today call succotash. The third sister is pumpkin, or squash. Large winter squash varieties could be stored in a cool place for several months. But for longer storage, the squash was prepared differently. It was cut into thin rings or long strips, and then, like corn, hung in a longhouse to dry. The dried pumpkin became light and hard. In winter, these dried strips were soaked in water and boiled to make a sweet and nutritious puree. It was eaten as a side dish or added to soups. The combination of corn, beans, and pumpkin provided a complete set of essential amino acids, fats, and carbohydrates. However, the most unique storage method used by the Iroquois was underground barns. They dug large pits in dry soil, often inside or next to a longhouse. The walls and bottom of the pit were carefully lined with dry grass and thick layers of bark, most often elm, to create a waterproof seal. Dried corn and beans were poured into these storage pits. The pit was then covered again with bark and a layer of earth, carefully camouflaging it. In such a dry, cool, and dark place, the grain could be stored for years, protected from rodents, moisture, and, importantly, enemies. This complex system of agriculture and storage was the foundation of Iroquois society. It allowed them to live sedentary lives in large villages and maintain a high population density. Their ability to survive the winter depended not on luck in hunting, but on hard work and ingenious engineering solutions for preserving the harvest. If you enjoyed this story about how ancient agricultural technologies saved lives, please like this video. It helps us create more content like this. What if I told you that deadly poison could be turned into nourishing bread? For many peoples of the eastern forests, including the Iroquois, acorns were one of the most abundant and accessible sources of food. However, this accessibility came at a high price. Raw acorns contain large amounts of tannic acid, or tannin, which makes them not only bitter, but toxic to humans. Consuming large quantities of unprocessed acorns could lead to serious health problems. Therefore, before an acorn could be eaten, it had to undergo a long and complicated purification process. This process, called leaching, was one of the greatest culinary and chemical discoveries of antiquity. Acorn gathering was a labor-intensive autumn activity in which the entire community participated. Women and older members of the tribe collected thousands of acorns, giving preference to certain types of oak, such as white oak, whose fruits contain less bitterness. The harvested crop was first thoroughly dried in the sun. After drying, the acorns had to be cracked and cleaned of their hard shells. The kernels were then ground into flour using heavy stone mortars and pestles. The result was a coarse, light brown flour, still full of bitter tannins. The most important stage began: leaching. There were two main methods. The first was the hot water method, in which the acorn flour was boiled repeatedly in clay pots. After each boiling, the water, which had turned dark from the tannins, was drained and replaced with clean water. This process was repeated over and over, sometimes 5 or 6 times, until the water remained clear and the flour lost its bitter taste. This required a huge amount of firewood and clean water. The process was long, but it allowed for a relatively quick turnaround time. The second method was slower, but less labor-intensive: leaching with cold water. The acorn flour was poured into porous baskets woven from grass and bark. These baskets were either placed in a stream with running water or repeatedly watered with clean water, allowing it to seep through the flour. Sometimes wood ash was added to the water to speed up the process. The alkali contained in the ash helped neutralize the acid. After a few days or even weeks, the flour became completely safe and ready for consumption. The resulting flour was an invaluable winter resource. It was rich not only in carbohydrates, but also, more importantly, in fats, which were often lacking in plant foods. This flour was used to bake flatbread on hot stones or in the ashes of a fire. It was also used to cook a thick porridge, similar to corn porridge, which served as the basis of the winter diet. The flour was used as a thickener for soups and stews made from dried meat and vegetables. This technology turned the poisonous forest nut into one of the pillars of survival. Have you ever imagined how much work went into making a simple flatbread? But what if the most important resource was not found on trees, but right at the water's edge in frozen swamps? In the next chapter, we will talk about a plant that was food, home, and medicine. Cattail, often mistakenly called reed, was one of the most versatile and important plants for indigenous peoples across North America. From the Great Plains to the eastern woodlands, this plant, which grew in abundance in swamps and along riverbanks, was nature's supermarket. Every part of it had a use, but it was in winter that its roots saved lives. The main value of cattail during the cold season was its rhizomes, or roots. These long, creeping roots, hidden under a layer of silt and icy water, are a veritable storehouse of nutrients. They are rich in starch and carbohydrates, which made them a vital source of calories when other food was unavailable. Harvesting cattail rhizomes in winter was incredibly hard work. Men and women had to break through the ice in the marshes and search for rhizomes in the icy mud with their bare hands or digging sticks. It was cold and wet work, but the reward was too great to pass up. The harvested rhizomes were brought to the dwelling and thoroughly washed of dirt. The easiest way to use them was to bake them whole in the ashes of a fire. The burnt outer shell was removed, exposing a white, fibrous, but very nutritious core that could be chewed. However, to get the most out of the rhizomes, they were processed. They were dried, then methodically crushed and ground in stone mortars. The hard fibers were separated, and the remaining powder was pure, high-quality starch. This flour was one of the main winter foods. Cattail flour was never eaten on its own. It was used as a universal thickener for soups made from dried meat or fish. It added not only thickness, but also calories to dishes. This flour was also mixed with corn or acorn flour to bake flatbread. Although the roots were the main winter resource, cattail was prepared for winter in advance. In summer, its golden pollen was collected from male inflorescences. This pollen, rich in protein and vitamins, was carefully collected in bags, dried, and stored. In winter, it was added to porridge and flatbread as a valuable nutritional supplement. Even cattail fluff, which ripened in the fall, was vitally important. Although it was not eaten, it was an indispensable insulating material. This fluff was used to stuff winter shoes and moccasins and as insulation for clothing to preserve precious warmth in severe frosts. The lower parts of young shoots harvested in spring were a delicacy, but it was the winter rhizomes that were the basis of survival. The ability of this plant to store energy in its underground parts made it a reliable source of food when the ground was covered with snow. Cattails are a striking example of how indigenous peoples saw a whole range of solutions in a single plant. It provided food, insulation, and material for weaving mats and shelters. Knowing how and when to use cattails was key to survival in the harsh conditions of the wetlands. Want to know the secret that turned ice into sweet gold? At the end of a long and harsh winter, when supplies were running low and the spring hunt was still far away, a special season began for the peoples of the eastern woodlands, especially the Iroquois and Algonquians. It was the time of maple sap collection, the time when nature gave its first gift of the new year. This process, which today has become the syrup industry, was a way for indigenous peoples to obtain a vital product: hard maple sugar. It began during that short period at the junction of winter and spring, when daytime thaws were followed by nighttime frosts. It was these temperature fluctuations that caused the maple trees to weep, to secrete sweet sap abundantly. Before the advent of metal tools, the collection technique was simple and ingenious. A V-shaped cut was made in the bark of the maple tree with a stone axe. A wooden trough or piece of bark was inserted into the lower part of the cut, through which the sap flowed into a container placed at the foot of the tree. Simple but effective birch bark troughs were most often used as containers for collecting sap. These vessels were lightweight, waterproof, and could be made in large quantities right on site. Sap collection was a collective effort involving entire families. The collected sap was mostly water, with only a slightly sweet taste. To turn it into a concentrated product, it was necessary to remove excess moisture. Before the advent of metal boilers, this was a very difficult task. The Iroquois solved it using the hot stones method. The juice was poured into a large trough hollowed out of a single tree trunk or into large clay pots. A huge fire was lit nearby, in which dozens of stones were heated until red hot. These hot stones were then transferred with tongs and lowered directly into the juice. The juice in the trough instantly boiled and hissed, releasing clouds of steam. The cooled stones were removed, thrown back into the fire, and replaced with new hot ones. This monotonous process continued for hours and sometimes days, requiring constant maintenance of the fire and replacement of the stones. As the water boiled away, the juice became thicker and sweeter, turning into syrup. But the Iroquois did not need syrup, which is difficult to store. They continued the process until the liquid became very thick. Then it was quickly stirred, which led to crystallization. The hot crystallized sugar was poured into wooden molds or simply allowed to harden into large chunks. In this solid form, maple sugar could be stored indefinitely. It was light, portable, and incredibly caloric, the perfect product for warriors, hunters, and travelers. In winter, this sugar was not just a treat. It was added to bland corn porridge to make it tastier. It was mixed with water to make an invigorating drink. A piece of maple sugar could give a hunter the quick energy boost they needed during a long trek through the snow. How different do you think the taste of that ancient sugar was from modern sugar? Sugar provided energy, but in the north, in the subarctic, another more nutritious grain was needed. In the next chapter, we will go to the lakes and learn about wild rice. On the frozen lakes and marshes of the subarctic and Great Lakes regions, home to the Ojibwe and Cree peoples, one of the main winter foods was manumin, or wild rice. This tall aquatic plant, not actually rice but a type of grass, was as important to them as bison was to the Plains tribes, or corn was to the Iroquois. Gathering and storing it was essential to their winter survival. Wild rice was harvested in the fall, in late August or September. This process was strictly regulated and full of rituals. The harvest took place from a canoe. Usually there were two people in the boat. One person at the stern slowly guided the canoe through the thick rice thickets, while the second, most often a woman, harvested the crop with the help of two sticks called beaters. With one stick, the harvester gently bent the rice stalks over the side of the canoe, and with the other, he lightly knocked the ripe grains out of the panicles. The grains fell directly to the bottom of the boat. This method was incredibly effective and, importantly, environmentally friendly, as some of the grains still fell into the water, ensuring a harvest for the following year. Once the canoe was full, the rice was taken to the shore, where the long process of processing necessary for long-term storage began. First, the freshly harvested rice was spread out on mats made of bark or skins and dried in the sun for several days. This dried the outer shell a little. The next and most important step was to roast or smoke the rice. It was placed in large containers over a very slow fire. Constant stirring allowed the rice to dry evenly, and the smoke gave it its characteristic aroma. This process made the outer husk brittle and ready to be removed. After roasting, the husking or rice dance stage began. For this, a pit was dug in the ground and lined with skin or bark. A portion of roasted rice was poured into the pit, and then a person wearing special moccasins would enter the pit and begin to step from foot to foot, as if dancing. The friction of the feet against the grains separated the fragile husk from the kernel. It was tedious but very important work that required rhythm and endurance. The hard labor was often accompanied by songs and drumming, turning the work into a social event. After husking, the rice had to be winnowed. It was tossed in the wind in special flat baskets or on pieces of bark. The wind carried away the light husks, and the heavy, cleaned grains fell back into the basket. This process was repeated until the rice was completely clean. Only after all these procedures was the manuman ready for storage. The cleaned and dried rice was poured into leather or bark bags and stored in hiding pits, dug in dry ground and lined with bark to protect the supplies from moisture and rodents. In winter, wild rice was the staple of the diet. It was boiled in water to make a filling, protein-rich porridge. It was added to soups with dried meat or fish, making them thick and nutritious. Rice was often mixed with maple sugar or dried berries to make a festive and delicious dish. The importance of wild rice went far beyond simple food. It was at the center of the social and spiritual life of the peoples of the Great Lakes. The right to harvest rice in certain areas was inherited, and the process of harvesting and processing brought the community together before the long winter. While the Plains tribes depended on bison and the forest peoples on corn, for the peoples of the subarctic, such as the Athabascans and Cree, as well as for many groups in the Northeast, fish was the mainstay. The rivers and lakes of these regions were rich in fish, and the autumn spawning season signaled the start of mass food gathering for the winter. The spawning season, especially for salmon in some regions or whitefish in others, was a time of great abundance. Entire villages gathered at the rivers to take part in this vital activity. The success of this autumn fishing determined whether the community would survive the coming cold weather. Sophisticated and effective technologies were used for industrial-scale fishing. Large weirs or zocolia were built to dam the river, directing the fish into narrow passages. Woven basket traps were set up in these passages, into which the fish fell and could not escape. Nets woven from plant fibers such as nettles or the inner bark of willow trees were also used. At night, the fish were attracted to boats with torches and speared. The entire catch was immediately brought ashore, where the second, equally important part of the work began. The fish were mainly processed by women. It was a conveyor belt for cutting up thousands of fish carcasses. The fish were gutted, cleaned, and filleted. The method of further processing depended on the climate and traditions. In drier and windier areas, for example, among some Athabascan groups, the main method was wind drying. Fish fillets were hung on huge wooden racks. The sun and constant wind drew all the moisture out of the fish in a few days. In more humid and cooler regions, such as the Northeast, simple drying was not enough, as the fish could spoil. Here the smoking method was used. The fish was hung in special smokehouses or simply over slow, smoky fires. The smoke, usually from alder or willow, not only dried the fish, but also impregnated it with substances that acted as preservatives. This process also protected the fish from insects. Smoking could last several days until the fillets became firm and dry. The finished dried or smoked fish was tied into bundles or stored in woven boxes. These supplies were taken to winter dwellings. Dried fish was incredibly light but very nutritious, making it an ideal product for storage and transportation. In winter, dried fish was eaten in several ways. It could simply be chewed dry, like jerky. It was an excellent camping food for hunters who went away for several days. But most often it was used to make soups and stews. Pieces of dried fish were thrown into a pot of boiling water, often along with dried roots, rice, or berries. As it cooked, the fish turned the water into a rich, warming, protein-rich broth. This was the basis of the winter diet, allowing people to survive the months when fresh hunting was impossible. For peoples who endured long and harsh winters, one of the main threats was not only hunger, but also vitamin deficiency. The lack of fresh plants, berries, and vegetables weakened the body, depriving it of its vitality. Without vitamins, people lost their ability to do physical work, began to get sick. Their bones ached, their gums bled. All this was a consequence of winter exhaustion. Therefore, the indigenous peoples of North America, who lived in harsh conditions where snow lay for 6 months of the year, developed an amazing knowledge of nature. They knew how to find vitamins where, it would seem, only an icy desert reigned. One of the most reliable sources of life was rose hips. Their fruits remained on the bushes all winter, like frozen drops of the setting sun. The frost not only did not spoil them, but also made them sweeter, turning their hard skin into a delicate, translucent shell. These berries, full of vitamin C, were a real natural remedy for scurvy and winter weakness. Women and children, even in blizzards, went out to pick them, noticing bright red dots against the white snow. Often, rose hip picking turned into a whole ritual. Children helped their mothers, and the older ones taught them how to carefully pick the berries without getting hurt by the thorns. After picking, the berries were carefully sorted, dried by the hearth or in the sun on clear days, and stored in leather bags or birch bark boxes. In winter, a few dried fruits were thrown into hot water to make a bright red, fragrant, sour, and invigorating drink. This tea was not just a comfort during the cold season. It saved lives. It strengthened the immune system, helped with colds, restored strength, and brought a feeling of spring even in the darkest time of the year. But rose hips were just one of many natural allies of humans. In the summer, women stocked up on berries for the winter: blueberries, cranberries, saskatoons, honeysuckle, and blackberries. Each of them had its own purpose. Blueberries helped relieve eye fatigue and sustained hunters' endurance. Saskatoon berries, sweet and fragrant, were added to pemmican, giving it flavor and vitamins. Cranberries, thanks to their acidity, helped keep meat fresh and served as a natural antiseptic. Dried berries were often pressed into dense slabs called berry cakes. To do this, fresh berries were crushed into a pulp, spread on skin or birch bark, and dried in the sun or smoke. The result was thin, hard, almost leathery cakes that could be stored for years. In winter, pieces were broken off from these tiles, soaked in warm water, and added to porridge or soups, giving the food sweetness and color. Sometimes they were used to make a kind of compote, a rare luxury in the cold season. In the forests of the Northeast, Gaultheria, or wintergreen, occupied a special place, a plant with evergreen leaves and bright red berries that remained on the bush throughout the winter. These berries, known as wintergreen, had a distinctive minty taste and smell, which later inspired the creation of the oil of the same name. For indigenous peoples, wintergreen was not just a delicacy, but a real medicine. Its leaves were brewed into tea for muscle and joint pain, colds, and inflammation. During the harsh winter months, when hunting exhausted the body, this infusion helped to recover and relieve fatigue. Cranberries, which grow in swamps, were another life-saving gift from nature. Their berries could lie under snow and ice all winter, retaining their freshness. They were picked in late autumn and sometimes in early spring, when the snow was just beginning to melt. Cranberries were versatile. They were eaten raw, dried, crushed with fat, cooked with meat, and added to soups and pemmican. Their tart taste made food rich, and their acidity served as a natural preservative, protecting food from spoilage. Some tribes also used other hidden winter resources. In the tundra regions, they gathered duckweed and dug frozen roots of wild onions or lilies, rich in trace elements from under the snow. On the coasts, they ate dried seaweed, rich in iodine and salts. Everything that nature provided was used wisely and with precise knowledge of when to harvest, how to dry, and how to store. These humble berries and fruits were not just food, but part of the medical and spiritual culture. Each berry carried the energy of the sun in summer, preserved until spring. Each cup of broth, each piece of dried cake, was not only beneficial, but also a reminder of summer, of life continuing even under the snow. Thus, in conditions where modern people would not survive a week without pharmacies and vitamins, the peoples of the North and the Plains maintained their health and strength, relying only on their knowledge and observation. Their winter pharmacy had no glass vials or prescriptions, but it had everything they needed to survive: the sun preserved in berries and the belief that nature would always provide a way out. While acorns required complex processing to remove tannins, the peoples of the eastern forests gathered other nuts that were no less important for survival. Black walnuts, hickory nuts, and butternuts were a real treasure, valued primarily for their high-fat content. Autumn was nut harvest time. Entire families would go into the woods to gather these gifts from the trees. Nuts were collected from the ground and knocked off branches with long sticks. The harvest was carried back to the village in large woven baskets, and that was only the first step. Unlike acorns, these nuts had incredibly hard shells. It is impossible to crack a black walnut or hickory nut with your bare hands. This required special tools, nut stones. These were large flat anvil stones with small indentations and heavy hammer stones. Using these tools, women methodically cracked thousands of nuts. It was painstaking and time-consuming work. However, indigenous peoples did not simply extract the kernel as we do. They invented a much more effective way to extract all the benefits from the nut. After cracking, the nuts, along with their shells and kernels, were thrown into large pots of boiling water. This process was a form of culinary magic. The woody shells sank to the bottom, while the kernels and, most importantly, the oil they contained floated to the surface. A heavy, fat-rich emulsion called nut milk, or nut oil, floated on the surface of the boiling water. Women carefully removed this thick foam with special spoons or ladles. This process was repeated several times until all the fat was extracted from the nuts. The collected nut oil was an incredibly valuable product. It was thick, creamy, and extremely high in calories. In cold climates, fat was synonymous with energy and survival. This oil could be eaten immediately and tasted like thick cream. Most often, this hickory milk was used as a base for many dishes. It was mixed with cornmeal to make hearty flatbreads that were baked in ashes. It gave the bread a rich flavor and nutritional value. This oil was also added to porridge and soups. A spoonful of this fat could turn a bowl of plain corn porridge into a full, satisfying meal that could warm you up and give you energy for hours. It was also mixed with maple sugar to make a nutritious dessert. The mass of kernels and shells left over after boiling was not thrown away. The water was drained, and the remaining cake could also be eaten or used for other purposes. This zero-waste technology allowed the maximum benefit to be extracted from each nut collected. This nut technology demonstrates the highest level of ingenuity. The forest peoples found a way not just to eat the nut, but to extract its most valuable component, fat, on an industrial scale. This oil was their winter energy reserve, as important as bison fat was to the Plains tribes. We have looked at just 10 of the hundreds of foods that form the basis of survival for the indigenous peoples of North America. From the concentrated energy of pemmican on the Great Plains to the starchy roots of cattail and the complex storage system of the Three Sisters among the Iroquois, each culture developed its own unique response to the challenges of winter. These foods were not just sustenance. They were the result of thousands of years of observation, trial, and error. They represented a complex system of knowledge about botany, chemistry, and ecology. The people of these cultures knew how to see food where modern humans see only a barren landscape. Under the snow, in icy water, in bitter acorns, and on thorny bushes. Their methods, whether leaching acorns, smoking fish, or turning maple sap into sugar, were ingenious preservation techniques. They allowed them not only to survive the winter, but also to maintain a complex social and spiritual life during the harshest months. This legacy teaches us foresight and a deep respect for nature, where nothing is useless. Tell us in the comments what other aspects of the life and culture of the indigenous peoples of North America you would like to see in future videos. Your ideas help us determine topics for new research. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next episodes.